and welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and it's great to have you here. There once used to be a time when any new announcement by Reliance Industries would be put under the microscope by the media. A rights issue, a new venture, a tie-up, even an annual general meeting. Everything would be examined with forensic detail by newspapers like the Indian Express, given the track record and reputation of Dhirubhai Ambani's company. It's a reflection of how high Reliance has soared, or perhaps a reflection of how journalism has been hollowed out, that there is nearly no critical commentary on RIL's recent announcements. Rather than investigating how Mukesh Ambani was able to swing deal after deal for Jio in the lockdown period when the whole world was shut, the media is in a celebratory mood. Rather than asking questions about the implications of a single company controlling the entire chain from production to distribution to consumption, newspapers are advising regulators to lay off. And rather than asking how Reliance will roll out 5G when it holds none of the patents, there are servile editorials on the company's pivot from the industrial to the information age. In this episode of JPod, I am joined by a business journalist who has written on Reliance Industries for 3 decades and more. Paranjoy Guha Thakurta is former editor of the Economic and Political Weekly. In a 43-year-long career in journalism, Thakurta has worked for newspapers and magazines and done books and documentaries and hosted television chat shows. Thakurta, who was at the forefront of the investigation of the 2G spectrum and coal allocation scams that dogged the Manmohan Singh government, has explored crony capitalism and illicit financial flows up close. Naturally, the Ambanis and the Adanis have attracted keen interest in his endeavors. In this podcast, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta discusses some of the issues that ought to be at the forefront of the conversation on Reliance Jio's latest deals. But before we get into that conversation, here's a short message.
Social media, a place where you get news, views, arguments, fun stuff, vicious rants, all of which can drive you insane. It's all so confusing. Don't you wish there was a way to cut through all the noise? Say hello to the Net Paper, a first of its kind newsletter, a digital newspaper in your inbox, one that gets you the news, the views, and the juice from Facebook and Twitter, TikTok and Instagram. If you wish to get the Net Paper in your email, do go to the netpaper.substack.com and hit subscribe. The Net Paper. All the juice that's fit to share.
The simple question, layman's question is this. We know this whole thing of data is the new oil, which Mukesh said. We saw Facebook talk of data being like water. Miraculously in India, water and oil seem
like the ocean.
Yeah, and Narendra Bhai said data is like gold. So we've had 3 versions, oil, water and gold, and seemingly they have really miraculously, we found the alchemists to mix them in India, But my key question was only this much, which is, why does the world's 4th largest company, which is Alphabet, which owns Google, and why does the world's 6th largest company, Facebook, suddenly find the need to do business with such a dubious player? And really, it is contrary to everything that tech majors are known for, the so-called sanctimony of the Silicon Valley.
Okay. Now, I'll preface my remark with a little bit of a background. Facebook and Alphabet are, as you rightly pointed out, among the 2 biggest corporate conglomerates in the world at present. I'm not getting into the details of Alphabet and Facebook, but the point is, outside the People's Republic of China, if you look at all the platforms that are owned or controlled by these 2 large conglomerates, so you have all the Google products and services, you have also the YouTube set of facilities. And most importantly, you must remember that Alphabet also owns the Android operating system.
Yes.
And the overwhelming majority of smartphones or phones, handheld phones or cellular phones in this world use Android operating systems. A relatively small proportion use Apple. And when you talk about Facebook, you're not just talking about Facebook, you're talking about WhatsApp, you're talking about Instagram, and you just look at the numbers. These platforms controlled by these two conglomerates would account for, I would say, well over 80%.
Yeah.
Some would say 90% plus of all the data that traverses and moves across the internet outside China.
Yes.
So this is how powerful these two conglomerates are. Now, let's look at India. India is, outside China, the biggest markets for both Alphabet and for Facebook. One set of statistics. India has about roughly 135 crore people, 1.35 billion people. If you look at the last set of figures of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, you'll find that the number of SIMs, subscriber identity modules, has exceeded, I think, 1.1 billion. You just get the exact figure, the latest figure from the TRAI website. You come in number of subscribers.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be, in your phone, you could have more than one SIM.
Of course.
Or there could be people with more than one phone. So it's not an exact, it's not that every SIM means one individual. No, far from it. But what is clear, that in many, many parts of India, and it's not just, it's even like rural areas, in large parts, I think most parts of India, there are more SIMs than human beings.
Yes.
Point one. Point two is when you look at the big picture again, in 2019, the number of Indians who were over the age of 18 as on the 1st of January 2019 and therefore eligible to vote in the Lok Sabha elections that took place that year is roughly in the region of 90 crore, 900 million people.
Yeah.
And WhatsApp claims it has 400 million or 40 crore users.
Yeah.
So that is the sheer size of India and the numbers involved. So the biggest information technology, digital monopolies on the planet has to have a presence in India. Has to, must. Reliance Jio, as we've already discussed a little while ago, literally it started its test runs earlier, but it actually formally launched in the month, if I'm not mistaken, it's September of 2016. 3 years later, in terms of number of subscribers, it was right on top.
Yeah.
So, Reliance Jio has become huge. And the second point that needs to be noted, once upon a time, there were as many as about 15 mobile telecom players in India.
Yeah.
Everybody wasn't there in every part of India, but that was once a number.
Yeah.
That number, for all intents and purposes, has shrunk to 3.
Yeah.
Reliance Jio, the Idea for Vodafone combined, the Bharti Airtel group, And if you want to be actually factually even more accurate, there is a fourth player, actually rather a fourth set of players. That's Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited and Mahanagar Telephone Limited. They are languishing in the margins. So effectively, you have a market which is dominated by these few players. Clearly, both Alphabet and Facebook see that their best bet is to tie up with the corporate conglomerate, which is headed by India's richest man. They believe that not only is he politically well connected, they believe that he is really going to lick the competition hollow, as he has. I mean, how he did it is, of course, another story. How Reliance got its broadband wireless access act through, at that time, an obscure company which was part of the Nahata family. That's another story again. So there are many, many stories to be told. But the short point is, I think both Facebook and Alphabet realize that if they have to do business in India, they just can't ignore Reliance Jio. And as you rightly pointed out, once upon a time, a spokesperson of Facebook said, no, data is not the new oil, because this was almost in reaction to what Mukesh Ambani had told his own shareholders approximately a year ago in 2019 at the annual general meeting of Reliance Industries Limited. And he talked about data being the new oil. And the Facebook spokesperson, I don't remember his name offhand, but I can easily find that out. He said, perhaps the analogy is not an appropriate one. It's like this huge ocean. It's like water. But our Prime Minister knows best. Mm-hmm. Our Honorable Prime Minister, Sri Narendra Modi, knows better than others anything else. And he perhaps knows the ancient Hindu art of alchemy better than others. How to convert water into oil and then gold.
The question still is that Facebook and Google became what they became in spite of Reliance Jio. I mean, it's not as if they required Reliance Jio to become what they have become. What I sense is that they feel duty bound to tie up just now, which I find quite odd, for all this sanctimony. And secondly, it's also quite cutely timed with this whole Chinese incursion and the blowback against Chinese 5G technology. So it all just seems to be too pat. It just seems to fit into a pattern. Where,
Look, KP, there are no doubt of conspiracy theories. The way the promoters group reshuffled its shares just before the Facebook deal.
Correct.
But what we've been able to document, and it hasn't been contradicted so far, is how the government, that is, different wings of the government and regulatory bodies. When I say government, I mean Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Corporate Affairs. When I mean regulatory authorities, I mean the Reserve Bank of India, I mean the Securities and Exchange Board of India. How these people have tweaked rules. I mean, they've done it in a way which has a bigger, broader justification. But the single biggest beneficiary of the tweaking of the rules has been Reliance.
Yes.
Now, you might say, so what's new?
Yeah.
It's been going on from Dhirubhai Ambani, the late Dhirubhai Ambani's time. Sure, I don't disagree with that. But here is a case of a company, India's biggest in the private sector, that is apparently prospering at a time when just about everybody's getting screwed royally.
Absolutely.
Okay, I mean, pardon my Bangla, but I think you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
How is it that here was a company literally in barely 3 years becomes a market leader?
Absolutely.
And And here again, we look at regulatory authorities, in this case, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Now, the TRAI has good justification for all the changes and all the rules and all the norms and all the policies it's made. But Reliance's relatives, oh, sorry, what am I saying, relatives?
Competitors.
Erstwhile competitors and present competitors as well, have argued that the playing field has not been level. That this is like a unfair competition. That it's not even capitalism. It's like crony capitalism. It's like oligarchies at work. So essentially, this is the story. You could argue, as we have, and we will be in our future articles, raise a question as to Facebook whether it's paid a little more than it should have for the shares in Jio. We do not know when the shares when Jio will be hived into an independent. It will be made into an independent entity. It is an independent entity within Reliance, but when it will have a kind of an independent existence and would say list on NASDAQ. Again, we have written on this. NASDAQ, as you know, is the world's biggest stock exchange on technology stocks, in particular, information technology stocks. And when that initial public offering would happen, what's the kind of price that the Jio share would command? Whether many of these players who have invested in Jio platforms, and that includes not just Alphabet and Facebook, but also includes bigwigs like Intel, the chip maker, Qualcomm, the technology provider, and others, sovereign funds. I mean, there's a long list, you know about that better than I. But the short point is, how many of them will then sell their shares? We don't know. These are questions. When will the shares go, or when will the shares be listed on NASDAQ? If it does, will the present investors go for an exit route and they'll sell their shares if they find buyers, and they hope at least to laugh all the way to the bank and back. The short point is the economy of the world and the economy of India, the economies of different countries in the world, with the possible exception of China, but certainly the economy of India is in one huge mess. So when we just talk about India and we talk about the world, whether it be the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or any other body, we are debating how much will India's GDP shrink. We are not debating whether it will shrink. Will it shrink by 3.5%? Will it shrink by 9%? Will it shrink by 10%? That's what the debate is. In the circumstances, there are a few players who seem to be doing very well. And it's not just the stock, not just the stock market. In terms of what players like Alphabet and Facebook and Intel and Qualcomm and others and all the sovereign funds, they see obviously huge growth opportunities that they don't see elsewhere.
Paranjoy, from what you know, do you suspect that these deals were negotiated and swung during this lockdown period, or were these deals with Facebook and Google being negotiated long before the lockdown began and before the pandemic began?
I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
What does it sound like to you? What do you suspect?
What seems to me is logical that there were discussions that were going on for some period of time. Remember, Reliance announced its, if you look at the chronology, it just happened soon after the lockdown. So even if these discussions had been taking place over a period of time, certainly they were clinched during the lockdown. On that, there's no doubt. That's That's factually correct.
Who
Yes.
stands to benefit more from these deals? Reliance Jio on its own or Facebook, Google separately? Who stands to gain more from this?
Answer both sets of people. Who will gain more is the question.
Okay, who will gain
Now,
more?
this would be a matter of opinion, and this would depend on a whole set of factors about which it's difficult to predict what the future would be like. Notably, what would be the price of the geo platform's share as and when it is listed on Nasdaq?
Do you think a deal like this or all these 14 deals that Geo Platforms has struck with various companies, will this stand the Competition Commission's scrutiny or you think it will sail through?
I think there's every reason to believe that it would sail through. The Competition Commission of India has already given the green signal to some of these deals. Therefore, I do think that there is a possibility, I mean, there is a distinct possibility that all these deals would be formally approved by the Competition Commission of India. Yes.
Alphabet, which owns Google, is the fourth largest company in the world. Facebook is the sixth largest company in the world. Reliance is the 63rd largest company in the world. Facebook and Google have worked in India, have done business in India, have actually conquered Indian minds and mobile phones for a long time. Why do you think, in one sentence, why do you think they have had a need to tie up with Reliance Jio?
Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, all these individuals, I think, realize that even Reliance, in terms of its rank on the Fortune 100 or the Forbes 100, maybe somewhere there, Mr. Mukesh Ambani happens to be the first Asian to have gate crashed into the league of the top 10 richest men in the world. Jack Ma, the member of the Chinese Communist Party, is not there.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, K.S. Lee Ka-shing, the founder of the Hutch Group, the Hong Kong-based entrepreneur who started his career to support his widowed mother selling handkerchiefs and plastic watch straps on the streets of Hong Kong, and went on to become one of the richest men in Hong Kong and then the world. Where is he in the top 10? But how are these lists compiled? What is the basis? You calculate an individual's wealth on the basis of the market capitalization, not the market capitalization, the market value of the company, of a company's share at a given point in time.
Yeah.
That will fluctuate. It fluctuates within a day. It will certainly fluctuate within a week. And we don't know. But as of now, Mr. Mukesh Dhirubhai Ambani is in the top 10. He's number 8. See, WhatsApp took its own time. I think at least a few years it took before it got the Reserve Bank of India's green signal to start its payments applications. Google Pay got it earlier. There was this big rivalry, and Facebook was lobbying very hard. He said, if Google Pay can get it, why can't we? And so the whole issue was really of issues pertaining to data localization, where you store the data within India or not. But all this is happening. So Reliance is also not just big in data and mobile communication. It wants to be one of the biggest players in retail. Oil and gas is down in the dumps. The deal with Aramco, if you heard Mr. Mukesh Ambani's speech yesterday, is in a bad shape.
Yeah.
And he says so, that it's because of all that's happened, with oil prices collapsing for a brief period of time. They even went, in the futures market, it went negative, but that was an aberration. The founders of Alphabet and the founder of Facebook clearly think that if they have to do business with India, they have to do business with Mr. Ambani's conglomerate. India is not China. Facebook can't go into China. Google has gone a little bit here and there, but Google is not available in China because China has its own version of Google, it's its own version of Facebook, etc., etc. India will never have that kind of a situation. It's the most unlikely. So if they have to do business with the world's largest market, or what they perceive as the world's largest market, they have to do business with India. I'll just add one more point and I'll finish. See, China has about 1.4 billion people. India has 1.35 billion people. Demographers have all kinds of estimates. But most people believe that anywhere from the next 5 to 10 years, India's population will overtake that of China. But there's one critical difference, the demographic profile of India. Roughly half of India is below the age of 26. Some people say 25, some people say 26. The median age, that is the maximum number of people, Indians, what age are the maximum number of Indians? And that is supposed to be 27, some people say 26. Now, again, I'm not a demographer, but this is the crucial difference between the world's two most populous countries, who at this point of time maybe at loggerheads post Ladakh. But the short point is Alphabet and Facebook, if they have to do business in India, they think their best bet is Mr. Ambani.
Which is very funny and interesting in the sense that if Dassault wants to come into India to make the Rafale aircraft, they have to tie up with Anil Ambani. If Facebook has to come to India, they have to tie up with Mukesh Ambani. If you want a port, you have to tie up with Gautam Adani. So what does it tell you, all this?
So you have to ask the question, who is more powerful?
Yeah.
Is it the Reliance Group minus your younger brother who is allegedly bankrupt, or the government of India? It's an excellent question. As a journalist, you should know how to ask the right questions, even if you do not know the answer.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer, but that's a good question, which you did not ask me.
Yeah. But, most people, one final question, most people seem to suggest, especially within the media, that deals like this are fine, that they should go through, there should be no blocking, etc., in the belief that this eventually benefits the customer, the consumer. Will this benefit the customer, these deals of this nature, in this kind of monopolistic market which is emerging? Will this really benefit the customer, or will in the end the customer be held ransom because there is no other competitor left?
It's a very good question you asked, and I don't have a simple answer to your question. Was the consumer better off when there were 15 players in the mobile telecommunication space? Was the Indian customer better off in terms of quality of service when there were half a dozen players? Is the Indian customer better off now that there are 3 or 4 players in the marketplace? Is this capitalism? Is this crony capitalism, or this an oligarchy? A good question. Again, I don't have clear answers to these questions, but let's look at it this way. Obviously, if the customer didn't perceive that she would get some benefits, why would they go to Jio? Remember, Jio started as a quote-unquote free service.
Correct.
Subsequently, it's no longer free. Now, there are many definitions of what is called predatory pricing, or what you might describe as a predatory behavior. And this is true across the world. You'll see in certain parts of the world, there are clear definitions in regulatory authorities. In the Competition Commission of India, it is defined in a particular way. Until recently, Reliance wasn't even eligible to be called a potential predator because it didn't have the market share. It was a newcomer. It was the new player. Now that it has emerged as a major player, a player terms of subscribers having a fairly dominant share of the market. Now, again, this word dominance, these are heavily loaded words. These have legal connotations in the competition law of India. How do you define predatory behavior? How do you define predatory pricing? I mean, let's look at it very crudely. Your textbook economics definition is the guy with deep pockets gives you something free. So he kind of hooks you on to his service, gives it to you free. And then you've got addicted. You know, he's like your cocaine peddler or your ganja peddler who gives you your first set of doses free of cost.
Yeah.
But after you're addicted, you have to go back to him. And then he keeps increasing his price. But you're so desperately addicted that you have to go back to him because there's nobody else you can go to. Is this analogy appropriate? I'm not so sure it is. Time alone can tell. Maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe it's a choice that has to be made by individual consumers, which may or may not have anything to do with the manner in which markets function. I mean, I, for one, never believed in this whole mythology of free markets. If the government of Australia had its way, then Google would have to start paying for all the content it distributes from the South Sydney Morning Herald or Australia's media companies. And now Google has suggested that it become a curator of content and a distributor of content, quality content. And actually, New York Times and many others, they've always been arguing for a long time. In Europe, the argument has been that the creators of content are getting a pittance because the monetization is unfair. The playing field is unfair. Therefore, Google, or rather Alphabet and Facebook, that consider themselves to be tech companies and not media companies.
Yeah.
Yet, they get more than the lion's share of the advertising revenue that accrues. Is this fair? No, it may not be fair. Surveillance capitalism, in the words of Professor Shoshana Zuboff, is really a global system of behavioral modification and changes. And according to her, not me, it threatens human nature in this century, in the new millennium, the 21st century. Just as industrial capitalism actually disfigured the natural world in the 20th century. But all I'm trying to tell you is that I don't know whether Reliance Jio can be classified as a predator. That's all I'm saying.
Very quickly, will these participations of Facebook and Google and all the other players, all those other companies, help them evade the kind of regulatory outreach that you've seen in Europe and Australia and America somewhat? Is that one of the reasons why you think they have come? For example, Facebook, had a big disaster when it tried to push in, a kind of a different internet, and tried to break the so-called net neutrality which was around.
And try refused.
And refused. But now with this kind of a tie-up with a very influential political and business player like Reliance, do you think it will be able to evade questions of regulation on the one hand, and likewise, all the questions from the media, because the media will now necessarily take a back seat because of the kind of players involved. So it's a two-part question. Will the regulation be kind of slightly slimmer than before, and will therefore Facebook and Google have their way, unlike in the past or unlike in the rest of the world? And secondly, will the media kind of play a slightly less abrasive, less aggressive role?
We all say monopolies are bad. You could argue that private monopolies are worse than public monopolies. You can argue. You can make an effective argument, and I'll tell you why. Governments change, political parties can change, civil servants or bureaucrats can change. But when you have a set of promoters and their families that control large conglomerates, then there is a very distinct possibility that that family could continue to control those monopolies for a long, long time to come. In the United States of America, there have been two notable examples of monopolies being broken up by legal means, by fiat, by government FIAT, fiat.
Yeah.
Standard Oil, also known as Esso, and the famous company that was set up by Alexander Graham Bell, which eventually became AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. There's a long story behind it, but the short point is these companies were literally forced to break out into competing entities, into smaller competing entities, because it was believed it would help the consumer and the playing field would be level. Elizabeth Warren, she's not in the race for this position of American president, but she was among those who actually publicly supported such a move.
Yeah.
In Australia, we've had lawmakers. In New Zealand, we've had lawmakers. In Europe, we've had various people who've argued that this is the best way forward. Others have argued for a more decentralized way of governing the internet. Yet others have felt that the internet should be called a public utility. And therefore, if the internet becomes a public utility, then it has to be regulated. Just like electricity or water or land, even if there is private ownership, it has to operate within a broad with a broad set of parameters or broad set of rules and regulations. Right now, the internet has none of that. India has always, its regulatory systems have been infirm, relatively weak, prone to capture, prone to manipulation, prone to institutional capture in comparison to other countries. And some of the more economically advanced countries. Therefore, I think both Facebook and Alphabet probably perceive that it would be easier for them to operate in India's regulatory environment than in the regulatory environment in other parts of the world. I don't know, but again, I can't sort of second guess on behalf of Mr. Brin and Mr. Page and Mr. Zuckerberg whether they believe that they face less heat in India, and not just in the months of May, June, and July, than they would in the United States of America or Australia or New Zealand or Germany or France.
No, I asked a second part to that question, which was the media. Back in the 80s and 90s, you had some opposition and some questioning of the Ambanis in the media. What do you think will happen now with this kind of a size and monopoly? And in fact, with the Ambanis actually very much in the media territory now.
So let me answer this question, because this is again not an easy question. It merits a slightly detailed answer. Now, the traditional revenue model was crumbling before COVID. Now it's completely broken. Over more than a decade now, some could argue even after the Great Recession, which was really 2008, you saw the so-called mainstream media organizations that were depending on advertising and sponsorships. Across the world, the expenditure on advertising, marketing services, sponsorships, in most parts of the world were declining. In some parts of the world, they were stagnating. In countries like India, uh, the rate of growth had slowed down. There was a distinct deceleration. More and more people were sort of reading much more on screens, handheld, desktops, laptops, than on pieces of paper. This was happening in the past too. This trend got accelerated, like hugely, post-COVID. Point number two is that this period of the last 15 years or thereabouts is also the period where you've seen the fastest growth of the internet. Today, close to 2 out of 3 people in this world are using the internet, have used it at least once, and a smaller proportion use it regularly. Now, what is regularly? We can work that detail out. But and if you look at the plot that graph, this has grown exponentially, and with it are old notions of copyright, intellectual property rights, and who pays for what you read, what you watch, what you hear. It's again become a huge, huge issue. That old model is completely broken. And therefore, we all have to reinvent ourselves. We journalists, I've been in journalism for 43 years. Every journalist, every media organization, every media person has to reinvent herself. Now, whereas there are some media organizations that have been more successful than others in monetizing content. Mr. L.K. Advani, now 92 years old, famously remarked about editors at that time. When they were asked to bend, they crawled. When somebody asked him a question about why did so many editors, why were they so slavish towards Indira Gandhi? So the question is, why are today's editors crawling without even being asked to bend? And here I use an analogy that is often used by others, but I picked it up from M.G. Devasahaya, the former Indian Army officer and retired civil servant. He said what Indira Gandhi did was like jhatka. You cut the goat with one slash of your knife. What has been happening over the last 6 years has been halal, the slow bleeding, slow squeezing, which is why you're left with very few journalists like you who are willing to hold truth to power, ask difficult questions to whoever is in power and authority, and play the role of that proverbial mirror to society, not the lapdog, but the watchdog, the guide dog.
You see, before the weeks of these announcements by Reliance, you saw a bunch of editorials of newspapers demanding, especially after the Australian verdict, newspapers in India demanding in editorials across the country that Facebook and Google should start paying. Okay? What happens to
the
that?
Times of India, including Times of India.
Yeah. So what happens now when Facebook and Google are part of the Reliance gang?
Excellent question that you've asked. Very, very good question you asked. And I think they'll continue to say this. Remember that Facebook itself has done a number of changes. It's had this independent sort of committee of eminent public figures who would act like ombudsmen so that they would look at, to actually scrutinize cases of hate speech, scrutinize instances where the content that is on Facebook would actually have resulted in genocide of the kind that took place in Myanmar among the Rohingya Muslims. Or they would say you can't have a kind of a situation that you had in New Zealand, where a gunman shot people outside a mosque and broadcast it live. Today you're seeing Twitter standing up to Trump, not Facebook. We have to wait and watch how these two conglomerates behave. So clearly, there is within Facebook some pressures. The pressure also came because some of the biggest advertisers withdrew advertising from Facebook, notably Coca Cola. Google, as I already mentioned, is now saying, yeah, we're going to pay for content. We're going to pick and choose. We're going to curate content. So, NYT, we like your story. So, we're going to pay you X amount of money. You, Krishna Prasad, I love the story you did. So, I'm going to promote your story and actually pay you to promote the story. Why are they rethinking along these lines? Because obviously it's part of the blowback, part of the pressures that people are being, part of public pressure. Because what are you saying? Those who research, those who write, those who spend money traveling, meeting people, taking pictures, shooting videos, slogging their ass off to produce articles, stories, videos, documentaries for you. Do they not deserve a decent livelihood? Do their home fires have to continue burning? Do their children, their education bills and rents not have to be paid? Philanthropy works up to a point. The whole issue once again goes back to the nature of capitalism. Is information like any other commodity? And we go back to the analogy which we started. Is data water, oil, or gold? Answer all three.
Yeah.
How it's used, how it's misused, how it's packaged, how it's marketed, how it's monetized, and so on and so forth.
In 2014, especially in 2014, the mobile phone and data was supposed to have played a very big role in the election of Mr. Modi to power, and certainly more so last year. Will this set of alliances that Jio has swung actually impact 2024, you think?
Very difficult to say, very difficult question to answer. I can't predict the future. But one thing I can tell you, and if you go through some of the work that I have written or co-authored with others, what was very clear as far as the Election Commission is concerned, it's very basic. The Election Commission of India had set up its own committee comprising its own staffers, people who worked in important positions in the Election Commission, together with government officers. Okay? It prepared a report before the elections. It gave certain guidelines. It gave, I won't say it gave certain guidelines, I stand corrected. It made certain suggestions. These suggestions were not taken into account. Mind you, this was a committee set up by the Election Commission of India, which had a fairly large representation from the Election Commission of India. Now, I'll give you one very important suggestion that came. One was that if there is a ban on political advertising and political content in the curfew period for the print medium, why is it not applicable for radio and television? Yeah, there are some practical issues. But the point to note is that all political parties, with the exception of one, said yes, the Election Commission should actually look at including all media and not just the print media to actually follow a curfew, have a a curfew period just before the elections so that people are not unduly influenced. All right. There was one party that said no, and that was the Bharatiya Janata Party. Now we know the practical difficulties. We know that despite what Ravi Shankar Prasad says, despite what a whole bunch of people say, Facebook, WhatsApp have a standard reply. They're saying end-to-end encryption. So, if a man murders another person in Rajsamand in Rajasthan, his nephew shoots that video and then it gets widely distributed, those ghastly scenes. The cops don't know how to book this guy on the basis of that evidence, of that WhatsApp evidence. Because end-to-end encryption. And WhatsApp says, we've got to change our technology. And this has got a lot to do with what the government may do on the whole issue of privacy. We have a bill which is, in my opinion, deeply flawed. Time alone will tell what happens to the law, how it is implemented, if it is implemented, in what form will it be implemented. Time alone will tell how the internet will be, sought to be regulated or not regulated, whether it will be a free-for-all. So there's actually a slew of issues involved as to where we're going to move from here.
Okay, Paranjoy, let's stop here. It's been good to talk to you. I wish we could meet in person and really hammer this Reliance issue out because it's such a juicy, lovely issue.
I'm not a person की जो इन सारे विज्ञान को जानता हूँ, लेकिन मैंने कहा इतने क्लाउड है, बारिश हो रही है, तो एक बेनिफिट है कि हम राडार से बच सकते हैं.
The theme music for J-Pod was composed by me, Krishna Prasad, using GarageBand. And many thanks to the radio and TV anchor Vasanthi Hariprakash for her support to the Net Paper.